Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us today for Story Hour in the Library. We'd like to thank Porter for joining us today, and we'd like to invite you back for our first one of the spring series on February 11th at 5 o'clock with Anthony Mara at 5 p.m. in the Morrison. We also like at this time to ask you to silence your cell phones, and if you have to get up during the reading, please do so quietly. And if you'd like to find out more about Story Hour in the Library, feel free to visit our website, storyhour.berkeley.edu, and you can also sign up at the front desk for our email list, and we email you once a month letting you know what our upcoming authors are. You can also follow us on Facebook and at the UC Berkeley Library Twitter account. At this time, I'd like to invite Dave up to do our introduction.
I am not Vikram Chandra nor Melanie Abrams. My name is Dave Dewar, and I'm the development director for the University Library. That's all you need to know about me. I'm really pleased to welcome Porter here. We were just talking about the fact he's transplanted himself, he and his wife, from Purdue and out here to teach at USF and other things. So it's really good that the magnet of the Bay Area for writing is still very vibrant. As he said, they never leave, so good, don't leave. Porter has written 4 novels. The Obituary Writer, it was a New York Times notable book. Drives Like a Dream and When the White House Was Ours were Chicago Times books of the year. And his latest, The End of the Book, which he will probably talk about today, was published last year, and it was a San Francisco Chronicle Book of the Year. The Washington Post called The End of the Book excellent, entertaining, insightful fiction. He has co-edited 6 anthologies, published fiction, nonfiction, op-eds, book reviews in many magazines and newspapers, and he does write a column on ebooks with the San Francisco Chronicle. He's been interviewed on NPR's Morning Edition and Diane Ram's show, among many other programs, and he's taught at a number of universities. I always like these progressions. He went to the University of Michigan, see, to begin with. This is good. Our current new university librarian hails from the 29 years at the University of Michigan. So even though he's not here tonight, I know he's feeling kinship here. University of Oregon, Purdue, as I said, and now the University of San Francisco. I love biographies of people, and I was talking to Porter about this. The USF biography starts out with Porter Shreve has over a decade of administrative experience. Now, I got to tell you right there, that sounds like a university to me. Jess Walter, who authored Beautiful Ruins and The Financial Lives of Poets, said Porter Shreve's The End of the Book is audacious, affecting, and elegiac, a terrific novel about a century of American letters that hums with the artist's deep desire to last. And that's nice. I like authors writing about authors. Paula McLean, who wrote The Paris Wife and most recently Circling the Sun, which is just out. Sherwood Anderson's George Willard shimmers back to life in The End of the Book, an artfully plotted evocation of Chicago in 2 centuries, and 2 aspiring writers deadened by commerce until for each an old love appears to reignite their best and earliest dreams. Porter Shreve delivers a richly layered hat tip to Anderson's impact on American letters and a highly rewarding story at every turn. And so we have to credit Andrew Irvin in the San Francisco Chronicle, who says Porter Shreve's charming new novel, The End of the Book, harks back to a previous era of American storytelling in order to raise some big questions about the future of books as we know them, and even about the very act of reading itself, clever and insightful. Somewhere I dug up a top 10 list of favorite books, and I'm just going to give you his top 3, okay? We could vote on these. Don Quixote, or as my British friends say, Don Quixote, Pride and Prejudice, and Great Expectations. So, the honor of that is great. You're going to ask him about his writing, but I'm going to give you a little quip here. In your opinion, what makes a successful writer, he was asked. A successful writer also needs to develop a habit of art, rooted, as Flannery O'Connor writes, in the whole personality cultivated over a long period of time. This includes seeing, listening, paying attention to the world around you with a particular intensity. Writing is no less a discipline than playing an instrument, and just as the best cellists combine talent and practice, so do the best writers. Porter Shreve.
Thank you so much, Dave. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's so nice to be here, among other reasons, because I'm here about once a week, sometimes twice a week, in this very room, because I live in a teeny tiny house in Albany. Everybody in Albany lives in a teeny tiny house, and I'm just one of them. Albany, which used to be part of Berkeley and is no more. It's its own little tiny thing, and we live in a tiny house in that tiny place. And so it requires me to leave it in order to get any kind of work done. And this is the place that I love, where I love to read more than any other. I also like the CV Star Asian Library. It's a nice place to work. So, I love it here, and I love being in the Bay Area. This was one of the best decisions that I ever made. And yes, this place is just swimming with writers, and it's a wonderful thing. Don Quixote, yes, I think Don Quixote is perhaps my favorite book, but that might be because my brother and I took when I was in my late 20s, we took a bike ride across the country, solo trip with just saddlebags and tents, and we biked from Seattle to Boston. Dipped the back wheel in the Pacific and the front wheel in the Atlantic, that whole thing with 4,000 miles in between. And I think I did that trip. I don't think my brother knew this, but I think I did that trip because I secretly wanted to write a novel. And I was not very good at finishing anything. I was not a finisher. And so I thought, okay, if I can do this, if I can stay in that chair for 55 days and not turn around or quit or go home and get to the end of something, then I could do the same and write a novel. So I finished the bike trip, and the novel thing was actually quite a bit harder, but it was a really good practice for eventually writing a novel. I mention all that because I carried one book on that trip, a great travel novel, Don Quixote. So that's perhaps why I really love Quixote more than almost anything else. I think what I will do is read a little from the end of the book, this novel that came out last year. I tend to like to read new stuff, but I've been working on a book of craft essays, and I don't think you want me to read about like how to plot or the importance of a significant detail. So I'm going to just read from my novel instead, even though it's a year old. And I think what I'll do is just read the first chapter and then take any questions. That's my favorite part. So I'll just get right to it. And as Dave was saying, in part from that Paula McLean quote too, you get a little sense of what the book is. It's a very difficult book to describe. Don't do this at home. Novelists, you need that nugget. I failed with coming up with a good nugget for my novel, because the problem is it's set in two different time periods. It's set in 1908, 1909 Chicago, and also 2008, 2009 Chicago. And there are a lot of parallels between these two time periods, but we don't know exactly how they're going to meet up until later in the book. And so you're following these counterpointed narratives chapter to chapter. And in the present line of action, we are following this guy who works for a giant internet company on a project librarians will be very familiar with to digitize the world's books. And he kind of hates the company that he works for. You've probably heard of them. I fictionalized them. They're headquartered not terribly far from here. And he secretly wants to be a writer at a time when books and book culture, and the physical book in particular, are under a lot of threat. So that's part of what's going on in the present line. And then an old girlfriend comes back. He's sort of semi-unhappily married after about a year to one person. An old girlfriend moves to Chicago, and that's sort of the plot is triggered from that. In the backstory, the historical part, I should note that this guy, Adam Clary's father, is a Sherwood Anderson scholar. And so the backstory, the 1909 story, is essentially a sequel to Anderson's most famous book, Winesburg, Ohio. At the end of Winesburg, Ohio, George Willard, the protagonist, is standing at the railway station in Winesburg, Ohio, and he's 18 years old, and he's ready to strike out for the big city. Sort of a classic kind of 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century novel, where the small town boy or girl goes to the big city, and we know he's going to go to Chicago, but the book ends. And so I was very curious, what would happen to George Willard if he arrived in Chicago turn of the century when it was the fastest growing city in the history of the world? Incredibly dangerous, incredibly wild, an absolutely lawless place. What would happen with poor innocent George Willard in that place? And so half of my book is that, and you come to realize how the two narratives hook up about 3/4 of the way in. But I'm just going to give you the present line. I'm going to give you the did I say it was difficult to summarize my novel? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let me just read the beginning. My father taught at 4 universities in 4 Midwestern towns, had 3 sons by different wives, and wrote 2 books, one published 40 years ago, and the other, volume 2 of the definitive biography of a once celebrated American writer, always on the verge of completion. Next month, end of summer, nothing left but the index and a little fine-tuning. Over the years, my half-brothers, our mothers, stepmothers, and I had looked into his office, a pack-rat midden of strewn note cards, manuscript pages, newspapers, boxes, overdue books, empty cans of Diet Right cola, and airplane bottles of Malibu rum. Long before his retirement from central Illinois, everyone in the family but me had moved far away from the town of Normal, whose name my father daily defied. So I was the one who had to drop in on him to see how he was surviving. This time was no ordinary visit. I'd made a special trip. And though I told myself not to worry, I was growing uneasy. I parked the Prius in front of the foreclosure home for sale sign at his curb and climbed over a snowbank. All the neighbors except my father had plowed their driveways and shoveled their walks, so I was up to my knees in snow so soft it squeaked under my sneakers as I high-stepped toward the door. There was his old Mercury Mystique, under a white shell, parked outside the junk-filled garage. It had been 3 days since Christmas Eve when a librarian I knew at the university emailed saying she'd heard about the foreclosure and hoped my family was coping over the holidays. I'd seen my father only once since summer at a diner he liked near campus, but he'd said nothing about trouble with his lender. We talked about the Cubs, as I recalled, whether this would be the season they broke the 100-year curse. In the end, no such luck. They won 97 games, but got swept in the opening round of the playoffs. When the email arrived, I was staying with my wife, Dara, at the motel her family ran outside of Dayton. I called my father that night, but he didn't answer, nor did he pick up on Christmas. So to Dara's annoyance, we headed home the next morning. It's nothing. I'm telling you, he's just embarrassed, she said in the car. My family's going to guilt me about leaving early until we see them again. This isn't about your family, I said. My father could be losing his house. For all I know, they've turned off his heat and he's freezing in there, or worse. Don't get melodramatic, Adam. It's one of your least appealing qualities. The man is capable of anything, I said. No one should be spending Christmas alone. He's not going to kill himself, if that's what you're suggesting, she said. He's fine. You'll see. But what you're going to do with him, That's another story. I dropped Dara off around noon at our apartment in Chicago, said I might be gone a night or two. She reminded me, though I needed no reminder, that our first anniversary was coming up on New Year's Day, a dinner we couldn't afford at one of the most expensive restaurants in America. I promised to return in plenty of time and made my way here a couple hours southwest on I-55. I'd seen my father fewer than a dozen times since he moved into this split level, bought 4 years before at the height of the boom on a zero-down, low-interest loan. Instant approval, act now, that had ballooned beyond the means of a 78-year-old retiree with a lifetime of bad habits. It was the first house he ever owned. A child of the Depression, he used to pay with cash, buy in bulk, collect the penny saver. He loved to bargain and drove my mother crazy with Saturday morning yard sale rounds where he'd come home with a trunk full of other people's cast-offs. Do we need another popcorn maker? That one cost me $1, barely used. And what are you going to do with 45 volumes of the 1961 World Book Encyclopedia? It's the Braille edition, a classic. I got it for a song. I couldn't believe my father had bought his own place. The apartment building where he'd cooped up since his last separation got sold to developers who planned to renovate and double the rent. And that's when it dawned on him that if he owned a house, no one would turn him out on the street. Instead of steering him toward assisted living or another rental where at least a building manager could keep an eye on him, I'd said there was never a better time to buy. Mortgage brokers didn't care about credit history anymore. Infuriating as he'd always been, this man who used to lock his office door and leave an empty chair at dinner or disappear for long weekends on research trips, he called them, to the Newberry, which my mother and I knew was closed on Sundays and Mondays. I felt sorry for my father now, whose career had peaked in 1968, who bore his steady decline on his shoulders like some nearsighted atlas, and whose failures reminded me daily of my own suspended dreams. I wanted my father to have something to call his, so when he got the pre-approved loan and started driving around town with a realtor who looked like an escort crossed with a mortician, I forgot that he was too dissipated to be living alone, his memory too much like his office, a dusty repository of missing and scattered papers. Before I had much time to think, my half-brothers were flying in from the coasts to help with the move. My father hadn't seen Michael in 3 years, so I arranged a weekend for them in Chicago. I put them in my apartment and bought them tickets to the Cubs, while Eric and I tackled the mess, decided what to take to the curb and what to haul to the new house. In the end, we lost our nerve and moved everything we'd wanted to throw away into our father's garage, afraid that the shock of a clean, orderly space would be too much for his heart to take. He'd had a triple bypass the year before, and cracks had begun to appear in the walls he'd spent a lifetime building around himself. I'd always been the one to call him, but after the surgery, he started phoning me at odd hours, could even turn wistful about the book that had bedeviled him for decades, his parental deficiencies, and his marriage to my mother, whom he called his twin flame and the great regret of his life. Perhaps he was trying to console me, or more likely to comfort himself, because my mother was no longer alive, and thus could forever represent the one who got away. But not long after he settled into his new house, Rue gave way to routine, and he burrowed in, stopped calling or answering the phone, grew irascible at my unannounced visits. A smattering of blue-sleeved copies of the New York Times and the Daily Pantagraph, the local paper, dotted his stoop. My heartbeat quickened as I picked them up, 6 in all, and brushed off the snow. My father always started his day with the papers, used to read aloud from the obituaries and from local stories that caught his eye. Kid loses arm playing chicken with a train. Lottery winner goes broke overnight. While my mother rinsed the breakfast dishes and rushed to school to run the library. I rang the doorbell and peered through the glass sidelights. The hallway was dark and empty. I rang again and heard only the muffled silence of white-blanketed suburbia, post-holiday, wood smoke brushing the air. My father's house, the odd hermitage in a family subdivision. I couldn't hear the bell working, so I tried the knocker. The name of the people who last lived here, the Fishers, remained etched in the brass. I wondered why my father wasn't coming to the door. why his newspapers had been growing cold for 3 days, his walk and car buried under snow. And it occurred to me that I should have gone to the hardware store last time I visited and brought back a new door knocker, or better yet, had one engraved. Clary. Dr. Roland Clary, Professor Emeritus at Central Illinois University, formerly of Indiana University, Oberlin College, and the University of Michigan, author of what might have been the essential biography of Sherwood Anderson had he only finished. Several major newspapers and journals reviewed the first book favorably. In this judicious, assiduously researched biography, Mr. Clary reminds us why the author of Winesburg, Ohio remains relevant today, wrote the New York Times. The second volume is sure to be anticipated by scholars and literary readers alike. Why, as I shivered under a purpling sky, was I imagining my father's obituary and wondering where, if anywhere, it might run? Did the world care about books anymore? Who would note the passing of an obscure academic, chronicler of a mostly forgotten writer's life? A writer's writer, my father used to say. Even he conceded that while Sherwood Anderson influenced generations of storytellers and for a time was a godfather to Hemingway and Faulkner, he was not in their league, but for that one odd book about a town of outcasts, grotesques, Anderson called them. Believe me, I knew that book well, and I knew my father well enough to realize that by devoting his days to the study of these grotesques, he had himself become one. I banged on the door with my fist. Through the glass, I saw the orange tabby Wing Biddlebaum round the corner and offer an insouciant meow. I studied the cat's face for signs of trouble, but he had the puffed, squint-eyed look of having just awoken from a long nap. He sat on the hallway tiles, licked his paws, and when I continued knocking, walked away with a vexed switch of the tail. I took out my cell phone and dialed, and I could hear my father's phone ringing inside. It rang, and still no answer. He was the last holdout against answering machines. Voicemail said cell phones were a swindle and a public menace. A few years before, I had set him up with an email account, but he didn't bother using it. And he called the famous company where I worked the grand colonizer of the information age. I had to admit, I didn't disagree. Stepping back, I looked up to the second floor windows. The curtains were drawn, but a single bulb lit one of the rooms, and I felt relieved that his power was still on. At least he wasn't freezing to death in there. But even on my unannounced visits, he did always come to the door, slippered and cardiganed, his ashy pallor blending with his incongruously tidy beard. Why wasn't he answering? Maybe he was taking a nap. Not that I'd ever known him to do so. But his engine was running down, and he did seem tired last time I saw him. Never felt better, he'd lied. But if he were napping, he wouldn't have left the light on. Now I was beginning to panic. I pounded the door harder, wondered if I should call the police, see if one of the neighbors had a key. Why hadn't I thought to get my own key made? I remembered reading about the Collier brothers, the reclusive hoarders of Upper Fifth Avenue who filled their brownstone floor to ceiling with junk. When a patrolman, summoned by a worried neighbor, broke in through a second-story window, it took him 2 hours to crawl to the corpse of Homer Collier, slumped amidst the rubbish in a tattered blue robe. It seemed that Langley Collier had gone missing, so a search fanned out across the city while police combed the house. Over the course of 3 weeks, they cleared away 3,000 books, decades of newspapers, and countless curiosities, a clavichord, bowling balls, an X-ray machine, dressmaking dummies, a horse's jawbone, more than 80 tons of trash before they discovered Langley, long dead, and it turned out just 10 feet away from where they'd found his brother. If Dara were here, she'd say I was overreacting. But I was my father's lone caretaker, and he was the closest family I had, so I braced myself for the worst. I trudged through the snow to the back of the house and tried to look in, but the windows were mostly frosted over and the rooms dark. I spotted a ladder beside the neighbor's garage, dragged it back, and leaned it against my father's house. I climbed to the second floor and rapped on the storm windows, pulled off my gloves, and tried to slide my fingers under the frames, but they were cased in ice. I was blowing into my hands and thinking about breaking a pane with my elbow like a B-grade action star when I heard the creak of the back door opening, then a familiar splenetic voice. "Get the hell down from there." In his living room, my father and I had it out. "What did you think you were doing?" he said. "Trying to give me a heart attack?" "Why didn't you answer the door?" "I've been sick with worry," I said. "No one's been sick with worry over me since my mother dropped me in the Pensacola River and thought I was drowned. You think I'm some old sentimentalist?" "I've been calling for days, Dad. I've been out in the cold for the last half hour trying to get your attention." "Well, you got it all right with your cat burglar routine." "Why did you ignore me?" I asked. "I didn't know it was you." "Who else would it be?" His friends had all retired and taken to the skies, celestial or the flyways that end in warm weather. "I've been getting nothing but calls and visitors." He flicked on a light, and I saw the tide of unopened mail and papers spilling out of the dining room that he called his office. I was still in my coat, and it was too cold in there to remove it. "What kind of visitors?" I asked. "Predators and harpies," he said, cawing their lamentations in the eerie trees. "People from the bank?" "It's none of your goddamn business," he said. Manuscript boxes filled the camelback sofa he'd had since the 70s when we lived in Bloomington. The dusty almond aroma of old books mingled with the smell of buttered popcorn, which my father had long subsisted on. I would have sat down, having traveled all day, but there was nowhere to plant myself. Every chair and settee was stacked with books. On his walls, he'd hung more photographs, creepy sepia portraits of other people's families, scored over the years at estate sales. My mother had drawn the line on this one fetish. Your own ancestors I can understand, but who are these people? I knew not to push my father, so I looked for a way around the subject of why I was there. I tried to call yesterday to say Merry Christmas. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Did you talk to anyone else?" He took off his thick-rimmed glasses and wiped them with the sleeve of his purple cardigan. He was slim and fine-featured, his silver hair no less wavy and no less thick and wavy than when he courted his first wife and left her for a classmate, escaped from his second wife into the arms of my mother, and abandoned my mother for a graduate student. "The phone rang a few times," he said. "You could have picked up. It was only me, and probably Michael and Eric. No one from the bank would be calling on Christmas." "Don't count on it," he said. With a wobbly hand, he put his glasses back on. "I could use a drink." Now, at this point, I usually take my flask out and have a drink, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to maybe stop right there, since we're sort of at around, if this is right, 5:34 or 5:36, 5:40-ish. So I'm hoping that on the note of I could use a drink, that would be a way to kind of lubricate some questions about this book, which again goes back and forth between this story, Adam, his father, his marriage on the rocks, his hating his job at Imigo, which is a big internet company made up by me, but all too familiar to all of us. And then this backstory with Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio sequel. So anyway, this seems a fine place to pause, I think. You could disagree, but I'd love to talk a little more about the book, or answer any burning questions, or slow simmering questions, or anything about it. Yeah.
I suppose you told us a little bit about the inspiration for the 1908-1909 setting. What I'm curious about is, did one of these stories come first? Did one grow out of the other, or was it from the moment you started on this project, were they both intertwined from the start?
Yeah, great. I had always, my first three novels are all linear. They're all pretty linear. They tend to be set in the amount of time that passes is rarely more than a year, and so it's a fairly tight structure typically. And I think that I knew I wanted to do something different, and I was really drawn at the time that I started the book to novels that were sort of homages to other novels, and in particular, Michael Cunningham's The Hours was a book that I really loved. My wife happened at the same time to be working on, she was obsessed with the Little House on the Prairie books, obsessed with Laura Ingalls Wilder as a kid. Interestingly, she was born in Vietnam and came to the States when she was less than a year old. And I think, and she would say this too, that one of the reasons she became so drawn to Little House is because it's a story of migration that, as an immigrant, she really connected with. So I was just, for some reason, there was something in the water or something in the air of our household, and where we were both really interested in kind of a kind of homage book, I guess. And so I started by just writing the sequel to Winesburg, Ohio, a book that I loved, and a book that I felt was underappreciated. Because there's only so much room in the canon of the 1920s, and Anderson's mentees, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and especially Faulkner, who really looked at him as their signal influence, sort of bumped him off the canon. So here's this sort of forgotten modernist who's really hugely influential but not known. And I was just, and I loved him because my mother's family's from Ohio. All of my relatives are buried in Ohio, in a town like this, New Philadelphia, Ohio, about the size of Clyde, which is the town that Sherwood Anderson was born in and which Winesburg is based on. This newspaper man, George Willard, just reminded me a lot of my grandfather. And so I had this kind of personal connection. Sherwood Anderson and I share a birthday. All this weird kind of connection. And I was living in the Midwest. I was sort of restless in the Midwest. A lot of Anderson is about restlessness in the Midwest. So there was a lot of this personal stuff that was finding its way in. And so I just wrote this sequel. This is a very long answer to your very good question. I wrote this sequel, and I got to the end of it, and it was novella length. It was a 150-page sequel to Winesburg, Ohio, and I thought, this is not enough, first of all. This is just a sequel to Winesburg, Ohio, and that's not interesting enough to me. So I sort of set it aside and was doing some short stories and some other things, and then it just occurred to me that maybe I should write another novella with this other novella in mind, and I started to see the connections between this novella set in the present and the sequel that I had written, and that became really interesting to me. And I think that, I wouldn't recommend this kind of structural experiment, but it ended up being the book that I wrote. And I think it was a breakthrough for me, just in terms of experimentation. So I felt like I really learned a lot writing this book, but that was the process. Yeah.
I haven't read Winesburg,
So I have to be a pitch man for Winesburg. Yeah.
But I noticed that your prose is just incredibly action-driven and very deliberate, and I was wondering if that is similar to your other work, or if it's just a departure or somehow influenced by the Anderson book.
It's funny. Anderson, I think my book is very different from Anderson's, and he's really a poet. And I don't think I think the hardest work that I have to do when I'm sitting down to write is the poetry part, is getting the sentences to be specific, evocative, to make it feel like a lived experience. I'm much more natural with plot movement and so forth, and so in that way I'm not at all like Anderson. And in fact, I worried that I was not going to be able to sort of live up to Anderson's standard on the line, because he's not interested in plot. In fact, he says life is a loose flowing thing, and so should plots be. He didn't believe in plot. And I do. So in that way, we kind of disagree. So my way of kind of evoking Anderson is to have an innovative structure, like a poetic structure. And because I'm very interested in plot movement, and my other novels are pretty plotted. And somebody who went through MFA programs and has taught in MFA programs for now 17 years or something, where plot is almost a dirty word. I'm like the rogue teacher who pushes plot. I believe in it. I never talk about it absent character, though. Plot is always an extension of character. I mean, plot is an extension of character motivation and character conflict and so forth. But I still believe in plot. So I mean, I think with this book, I couldn't help myself with the plot because I'm just that kind of. I'm drawn to it. I'm drawn to that kind of energetic movement. My hardest work was finding some poetry in the line.
So in the sequel, the style is quite different.
I think it is different. I think if you were to read Winesburg, Ohio, and then read my sequel, you'd say Sherwood Anderson definitely didn't write that. But I think that if it had been like an imitation of Anderson, then it would have just been an imitation of Anderson. I think of Nixon, for example. I think of the movie Nixon by Oliver Stone, and you think of Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Richard Nixon. He looked nothing like Richard Nixon at all, and yet he was Nixon. And I guess I was kind of trying to, and he didn't even try. I mean, I think the danger of kind of the danger of that of imitating is sort of so what. So at least that's the excuse I gave myself. I'm like, I know I don't write like Anderson, but I'm going to do this thing anyway. I hope I get away with it. Yeah.
Compliment you on some of the poetry, because I like some of the details, like the wood smoke and the papers being found on the stoop, and that shows an attention to like the atmosphere and detail, which gainsays what you just said about your attention to poetry.
Thank you. Yeah, I really, I feel I'm still a student. I mean, I really do. I mean, I know that's a cliche for people who publish some books, but I totally do. And I feel it's not a natural talent of mine, and I just have to keep. I mean, I literally have, for example, I keep a little notebook just on gestures. It's called Gestures, and if I see, I'll read Updike, for example. I'll read somebody who just can pull a gesture out of his hat that's original and fresh and amazing, and I'll just fill that notebook. Now, I don't ever exactly steal them, but I pay so much attention to the things that I don't do well naturally that I hope that I'm able to sort of sneak it into my language now. Because I'll always be bad at something. I can trust that. There's always something to work on. So, yeah.
Is that the only notebook you keep? Are there other things that you find yourself collecting?
There are, but they're more random now. And because of technology, I have, I could show you, but it's in my pocket. I use the the notes feature, and I use voice recognition. And I'm constantly making, I'm the person muttering into my phone, but muttering notes into my phone. And at some point, I then email myself and then put them into some kind of organized fashion. But I have a ton of random notes that way. But they're not, I think gestures and description notebook are the only ones that I have kept. And so that sort of speaks to the thing that I continually work on. Yeah.
Since you mentioned these places, is Albany, California, anything like Clyde, Ohio? And is the great growth of Chicago you described anything like the excesses of Bay Area?
Albany, I mean, I think Albany is too surrounded by. It's not isolated enough quite to be that. Although I have a feeling my kids are 6 and 4. I have a feeling I'll start to get tapped into the gossiping and the you see in small towns, and even though it's a small town in a big Bay Area, I kind of think that stuff happens anywhere. I mean, I think we're all guilty of regionalism and we're all sort of, if that's a guilt, I mean, we're all just local, regional people. So, and Chicago the Bay Area is much more tame than Chicago of the turn of the century. I mean, you see to this day just what a wild and wildly corrupt place that has been and has always been. Yeah, I'm always, it's fun. I think you'd say that you hear about this from a lot of writers, is I'm always about 10 years behind. I feel I'll be writing about Chicago for about the next 7 years. I've been here 3 years. I wish that weren't the case. I just somehow don't feel up to the task of knowing this place yet. I love it. I mean, it's the best place I've ever lived. But I feel like, I'm still in the honeymoon phase. And who wants to read a honeymoon? You want to read about hell. So, stories are hell-friendly, Charles Baxter says, and it's true. So it's like, I haven't found the grit in San Francisco yet, or the mean-spirited gossip of Albany yet to be able to, I got a story there. I can get after that. Everything's too nice right now. I mean, okay, it rained today. It's like, okay, wow, oh, God. So, I think that's where I am on that one.
Up here.
Yes, hi.
So you talked about we heard three of your inspirations from the past. Do you have possibly 3 current writers you can give praise to that you enjoy?
Sure, yeah. I got the rest of your list. Oh, okay, cool. I can tell you that I rarely do this, but 3 books that I had never read I taught this semester. I will usually only teach 2 books that I've never, and I thought they were all amazing. And one was Jenny Offill's Department of Speculation. Elena Ferrante is the real deal. Oh my God. She's unbelievable. So I'm going to just burn through all of her work, and I started with The Days of Abandonment. She is just ferociously good. She's wildly hyped right now, but she earns every word of praise she's gotten. And then I read, for the first time, Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, which is just a staggeringly good novel. I would throw that into my top 10 in no time. I mean, that's just a great book. But a tragedy, and I'm not generally drawn to tragedies. It's something. And then another book I love, just to add a fourth, is The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga, because it's so funny and it's about politics. It's about global politics, and I think it's so well crafted. I think it's so hard to do to write a great novel that is very political, but is still about people and characters and. I love that book too. That's on my top 10. I think that's my only. Yeah, I think that's my only living writer. I think I was chicken to put too many living writers on there, for fear that every other living writer would be like, "What about me? I thought we were friends." I don't even know Aravind Adiga.
Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
We'll write to him.
So those are 4 that I really like. Department of Speculation. Yeah. It's just really interesting. We're talking about Sherwood Anderson as a kind of somebody who's writing in the lyric mode, who's really writing in the poetic mode. That of those 4 novels, that's the one that's really written in the lyric mode. It's beautifully written and structured. It's sort of structured. It's a mosaic structure. It's made up of all these little teeny paragraphs and little short chapters that aggregate into this portrait of a marriage. Yeah.
If you could give 1 or 2 tips to future writers who are in this room, what would you recommend?
Just start there and just read all that, and then go down that way, and then that way. So that's one. Get a comfortable chair, but not too comfortable. I've come to feel like. I think that the 10,000 hours rule is an important one. But only when you're ready. That's Tolstoy or somebody said something along the lines of, you have to heal yourself before you can tell the world of your wounds, something along those lines. But I think that there's use to that. Take care of yourself, figure out who you are, and then maybe you can start to get to know other people and talk about them. So much of writing a great book is to know human beings and know how they behave and the mistakes that they made and how they deal with them, or fail to deal with them, more like. So, is that broad enough? You said two.
Any other questions?
Sure.
How long did your bike ride take, and how long did finishing your personal take?
The bike ride took 55 days. We took a big long break in Chicago in the middle of it, but mostly we would do like 70 to 80 to 90 miles in a given day, and we'd camp the whole way. But it was cool because we'd go to rural Minnesota and there would be a lightning storm and some dairy farmers would wave us in and we'd end up spending the night in their barn or in their, so that was a wonderful thing about meeting people on that trip. Most people were very, very generous. It sort of gave you a sense of people's capacity for goodness. So that took 55 days, but then my first novel took me 4 years. And I kind of consistently take about that long, which I regret, but it's just for whatever reason, I'm relatively slow. My mother's a novelist who's published 14 novels and 40 books for young adults. And we're related, but in many ways, I don't get it. I don't know how she does that. And she has 4 children. So, I know. Right, exactly. That's it. The 2 extra children. That'll be the extra fire that I need. I am not taking that advice. Anyway, yeah.
So digitizing, which you mentioned, as I was coming here, I was looking around and seeing all these great libraries full of books, and thinking, well, what's going to happen to the libraries, to the books? And people will still come and sit and read and write. But how is that going to change things? What do you think?
Well, you're doing ebooks.
That's true. Well, I got to admit, see, I'm doing I write a monthly column for the San Francisco Chronicle on ebooks because the book editor at the Chronicle felt we're in San Francisco. There are a number of startups doing these seemingly interesting ebook projects, and they really were. I really enjoyed the ebooks that I've read. But since the time that I began this column, maybe 2 years ago, and now, ebook sales are actually going down. And I don't think anyone has a good explanation for why. But people, it would appear, still want to read, particularly hardcover books. Hardcover sales are steady. So at the time that I wrote this book, it was looking like, everything was going to tank for hardcover with paperback soon to follow, and everything was moving in the direction of ebook. To everyone's surprise, that's not the case. So, I'm happy to say that my powers of prophecy were limited. But at the same time, I think it is possible that this is just a temporary, a kind of temporary thing where people still have this nostalgia. There is the generation who sort of between the ages of 20 and 40 have a great interest in old things. Tape cassette players, phonographs, LPs, etc. So there's a real sort of fetishization of old things. And so it may be that the book is in that category. I hope not. And that could explain why people are still reading hardcovers. I hope not. But so right now, I don't think anyone has a good answer, but it's a really interesting question to keep an eye on.
We're still collecting. That's good. And there are phonographs in this room and LPs over there that you can actually, they're functional. You can come in here.
and listen to LPs. Does that help?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.